What would you do if, on Christmas Eve, a little boy in a red coat walked up to a powerful CEO and quietly said, "I saw everything"? What would you do if those simple words shattered the armor of a man who thought nothing could hurt him anymore? This is the story of a billionaire who lost the only person he had left, and the child who refused to ignore his pain. Stay until the end, because you will see how 7 ordinary words can be worth more than 700 million. If deep, emotional stories resonate with you, take a second now to subscribe to this channel. Your like tells the platform that fragile, human stories like this deserve to be shared with more people. Comment where you are watching from, whether it is Christmas Eve or just an ordinary night in your life. Now take a breath, because what you are about to hear may remind you of something, or someone, you also lost. It was Christmas Eve in Madrid, and the city shone as if someone had spilled stars over every street. Lights wrapped the Gran Via in gold, Puerta del Sol glowed under its giant tree, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts and hot chocolate. Snow, rare, almost miraculous, had started falling at sunset, turning the buildings into something out of an old postcard. Families wandered through the streets, children laughed, couples walked arm in arm under the icy light. Christmas songs mixed with traffic noise and the murmur of people in a hurry and people with nowhere to be. Everything looked perfect, like one of those nights people remember forever. But in a quiet corner of El Retiro Park, close to the Crystal Palace, someone saw none of that. There, on a cold bench dusted with snow, a man sat, completely broken. His name was Alejandro Mendoza, 35 years old. In business magazines, they called him the genius of Spanish technology. He had turned a tiny garage startup into a 700 million euro giant in less than 10 years. He owned houses on 3 continents, watches worth more than most people's yearly salaries, and a calendar without empty spaces. His life was measured in meetings, mergers, acquisitions, and red-eye flights that blurred days into one. His assistant scheduled even his lunch breaks weeks ahead, as if eating were a luxury. For the world, Alejandro was a winner, the man who had everything. But that night, on that freezing bench, he was not a CEO. He was just a son who had lost his mother. The call had come at 5:30 in the afternoon. Alejandro was in the middle of a crucial meeting that would decide the acquisition of a promising startup in Barcelona. His phone had vibrated once in his pocket, then again and again, ignored like always when strategy was on the table. He had one iron rule: nothing interrupts the boardroom. Nothing is more urgent than the deal. On the 4th call, annoyed, he stepped out, ready to scold whoever dared insist that much. On the other end of the line, there was no sales rep, no journalist, no partner. It was a hospital in Seville, and the voice that spoke carried the cold weight of bad news. His mother, Carmen Mendoza, had been admitted that morning with a sudden illness, and she had been asking for him. She had asked for him again and again, as if his name itself were a kind of medicine. But his phone was on silent, tucked away while he negotiated another victory. While he talked about valuations and future projections, she fought alone against pain in a white, anonymous room. At 2:26 in the afternoon, Carmen died, calling the son who never arrived. When the doctor finished speaking, Alejandro's world cracked in one single second. He left the meeting without saying goodbye, without gathering his things, without looking back, as if the building had disappeared. He walked aimlessly for hours, through streets he didn't see, feeling neither the snow nor the cold on his face. There was only a vast emptiness and a guilt that dug its nails into his chest. He remembered every birthday he had missed because work couldn't wait. He remembered the video calls he postponed, the visits he promised and never made. He remembered the Sundays of paella his mother cooked with joy and he canceled at the last minute. He remembered her last birthday 3 months earlier, when he was in Singapore for a conference. Instead of being there in person, he sent an expensive bouquet and a short voice note. She had told him not to worry, that she understood, that she was proud of him. He had promised himself there would be time to make it up, to become the son she deserved. Now, on that icy bench, he finally understood that time had run out. Snow kept falling gently, piling up on his expensive coat, ignored like all his material possessions. For the first time since he was 12, Alejandro cried without control and without shame. He cried for his mother, for the boy he had been, for the man he had become. He cried for all the times he had chosen a contract instead of a conversation with her. He cried for confusing success with love, money with worth, achievements with presence. Each tear carried a memory, an unsaid, "I love you," a hug that never happened. The city celebrated Christmas, but on that bench there was only mourning and regret. And then he felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. He raised his head and saw him, a small boy, no more than 5 years old, standing in front of him. The child wore a bright red coat, jeans, and a beige wool hat pulled down over his ears. In his right hand, he held a shiny golden gift bag that looked too big for his little arm. Blonde hair peeked out under the hat, and his blue eyes were wide open with curiosity. Alejandro hurriedly wiped his tears away with the back of his hand, embarrassed to be caught like this. He didn't want anyone, especially a child, to see him at his weakest. But the boy didn't laugh, didn't point, didn't say anything cruel. He only tilted his head slightly, as if trying to solve a very important puzzle. The boy took a few steps closer, walking with a determination that didn't match his height. His boots left small footprints in the snow, as if each step were sketching a new path. He stopped right in front of Alejandro and studied his face with serious attention. It wasn't the quick, shallow glance of someone looking at a stranger on a bench. It was deeper, as if he were quietly measuring just how much pain this man was carrying. Finally, with a soft but very clear voice, he asked why Alejandro was crying. He didn't ask with morbid curiosity or with childish cruelty, but with genuine concern, as if the suffering of someone he didn't know was still something that deserved an answer. Alejandro hesitated, because he was not used to talking about his feelings, least of all with a child. His entire life had been numbers, strategies, targets, not emotions shared in public. But there was something in those blue eyes that simply refused to accept a lie. Something honest and clean that pushed him to tell the plain truth. He said he was sad because he had lost his mom that day. He said the word mom and felt his voice crack from the inside. The boy nodded with surprising gravity, as if he understood exactly how heavy that word was. He stayed silent for a few seconds, biting his lip, thinking very hard. Then, with the simple and brutal logic of children, he spoke words Alejandro would never forget. He told him not to cry so much, because he could borrow his mother if he wanted. He explained that his mom was very good at giving hugs when someone was really sad. He added that she also made the best hot chocolate in the whole world, the kind that healed almost anything. He said it with disarming naturalness, as if he were offering a toy or a piece of candy to a new friend. For him, sharing what he loved most was the most obvious thing to do. For Alejandro, those words were impossible and wonderful at the same time. A child offering his own mother to a stranger weeping on a snowy bench. Before he could answer, a woman's voice cut through the moment, calling the boy's name. Alejandro looked up and saw a woman hurrying toward them, worry written all over her face. She wore a light blue coat over a gold dress that peeked out at the hem. In her hands, she carried several shopping bags that smelled like a Christmas dinner prepared with effort. Her blonde hair framed a tired but gentle face, lit by the cold glow of the park lights. When she saw her little boy standing next to a stranger, her expression tensed immediately. She quickened her pace and scolded him softly but firmly for walking away without asking. Then she turned to Alejandro with an apologetic, guarded look. She apologized in a rush, saying she hoped her son hadn't bothered him with too many questions. She explained that Mateo sometimes talked too much to people, that he was very sociable. Alejandro quickly shook his head, still shaken by the boy's generous offer. He told her, his voice still unsteady, what her son had just said to him. In the woman's eyes something loosened, as if an invisible wall had just cracked. Shame, tenderness, and the intimate recognition of a familiar kind of pain crossed her gaze. She looked at Mateo, then at the man sitting on the bench with grief written all over him. And instead of leaving right away, she stayed there, letting the snow fall quietly around them. Her name was Clara Navarro, 34 years old. She was a primary school teacher and had been a widow for 3 years. Her husband, Miguel, had died in a car accident on a rainy November night. Since then, she had been rebuilding her life step by shaky step, only for Mateo's sake. She lived in a small apartment in Lavapiés, far from her parents in Malaga. There were no luxuries, but the house was full of drawings, books, and the warmth of daily effort. She was a woman life had not gone easy on, yet she refused to turn bitter. And she had raised a boy who could see pain in a stranger and want to heal it. Clara sat down on the bench, placing Mateo between them like a living bridge. At first she spoke little, still weighing whether it was wise to trust this unknown man. But when Alejandro found the courage to explain why he was crying, everything shifted. He didn't talk about numbers, or companies, or contracts. He talked about Carmen. He remembered aloud her Sunday paella, how the scent filled the house for hours. He described how she waited for him at the door when he came home from school with a snack ready. He told them about the bedtime stories she read long after he was too old for them. He confessed she had mortgaged her house so he could start his company. While he spoke, Clara listened in silence, without interrupting or judging. Her eyes filled with a quiet compassion made not of pity but of shared experience. Alejandro admitted how success had slowly pulled him away from his mother without him noticing. He admitted the calls had become shorter and less frequent, the visits rarer. He admitted he had assumed she would always be there, waiting patiently for him to make time. He said he truly believed there would be plenty of chances to make things right. Now, after that call from the hospital, he finally understood there would be no more chances. Every word he spoke was a mixture of love and regret arriving far too late. When he finished, it was Clara's turn to speak, as if she had been quietly waiting for that moment. She told them how she met Miguel in high school during a school trip to Granada. She remembered the awful poems he wrote her, which she still kept in a box under the bed. She described how they married young, against everyone's advice, because their love felt bigger than caution. She said Miguel had been a wonderful father during the 2 short years he had with Mateo. He had invented bedtime stories every night, doing different voices until the boy laughed too hard to sleep. Then one wet November night, a truck lost control on the road and everything ended. The police knocked on her door at 3 in the morning, and her world fell to pieces. Since then, Clara had learned to live one day at a time, sometimes one breath at a time. She had worked more hours than she thought possible and cried in secret when Mateo was asleep. She had carried the weight of raising a child who didn't understand why his dad never came home. But she had also discovered a strength she hadn't known existed inside her. She decided that if pain wasn't going to leave, at least it wouldn't erase love from their home. Mateo had grown up watching his mother fall and get up, cry and keep going. Maybe that was why he could spot a stranger's sadness and feel responsible for it. Maybe that was why he had been the one to break Alejandro's loneliness on that bench. The conversation between the 3 of them went on while the snow grew lighter and softer. At some point, tiredness finally caught up with little Mateo, who fell asleep between them. His head rested on his mother's arm, his small hand still gripping the golden gift bag. His breathing turned steady and calm, unaware of the extraordinary moment happening above him. The 2 adults looked at each other over the boy's sleeping head, connected by the same wound. They were no longer a CEO and a teacher, just 2 people who had lost and kept going. The cold felt a little less cruel with every honest word they shared. And for the first time in a long time, Alejandro felt truly seen. In a quiet pause, Alejandro looked at Mateo's sleeping face and felt something new rise inside him. It wasn't just tenderness, and it wasn't yet romantic attraction to Clara either. It was a deep desire to protect, to show up, to stop running away. In that child, he saw everything he could have had if he had chosen differently. He saw the simple kind of family his mother had always dreamed of for him. He saw a life where time was invested in people, not only in projects and profits. And for the first time he wondered if it was still possible to change the ending of his story. If he could stop being the man who always arrived too late to what truly mattered. The snow began to ease, and the lights of the Crystal Palace shone sharper against the dark sky. From the heart of the city, faint Christmas carols drifted in on the wind. Clara checked the time and sighed, knowing they had to go back for dinner. Mateo woke up half-dazed, rubbing his eyes in that adorable way only small children have. When he saw Alejandro was still there, he flashed a wide, unguarded smile. With the implacable logic of his 5 years, he asked if Alejandro wanted to have Christmas dinner with them. He said his mom always made too much food, and throwing it away was a terrible sin. Clara opened her mouth to apologize, ready to gently undo the child's invitation. She was going to say they couldn't bother a stranger like that it wasn't appropriate. She imagined he had other plans, another life, another table in some luxurious apartment. But Alejandro spoke first, and his voice sounded different, less armored, almost fragile. He asked, almost afraid of the answer, if the invitation was really serious. Mateo nodded with utter seriousness, like a boy sealing an important pact. Clara looked at both of them, torn between prudence and empathy. In the end, she chose to listen to her heart rather than her fears, and said they could come. That simple yes would change the direction of all three lives, though none of them knew it yet. Clara's apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms and a modest living room and lavapiece. The walls were covered with Mateo's drawings, old photographs, and simple memories. There was nothing luxurious, no designer furniture, no expensive art on display. But the moment Alejandro crossed the threshold, he felt something he had not felt in years. It was warmth, not from a heater, but from a place that was truly lived in. The radio played Christmas songs while the kitchen filled with the smell of roast lamb and potatoes. Mateo grabbed his hand and began showing him every corner of the house like a treasure tour. He showed him his block castle, his goldfish captain, and the little cars his dad had given him. Clara headed to the kitchen, improvising a dinner for 3 when she had only planned for 2. Alejandro offered to help, something he almost never did in anyone's home. She accepted, a bit surprised to see such an elegant man chopping vegetables by her side. His clumsy way of using the knife betrayed how little he did that kind of thing. But behind his awkwardness, there was a real desire to be useful, not just entertained. As they worked shoulder to shoulder, the tone of their conversation shifted. They no longer spoke only about past pain, but about the small, stubborn details of daily life. Clara shared stories about her students and the tiny victories of seeing a child finally understand. Alejandro spoke about his company from a side he rarely showed, the human one. He talked about the people who worked there, their ideas, and the projects that still excited him. For the first time in a long time, he was not speaking to impress or to convince anyone. He was simply telling the truth about what he loved and what he regretted. Clara listened with genuine interest, not because of his status, but because of the man behind it. The kitchen, with its mismatched plates and cheap radio, felt more valuable than any boardroom. The sound of the knife on the cutting board mixed with music and occasional laughter. Little by little, without either of them forcing it, a fragile trust began to grow. At dinner, they sat around a table that was almost too small for all the dishes. Mateo led the conversation, talking about school, friends, and impossible future careers. He wanted to be an astronaut, or a firefighter, or maybe an ice cream seller, so he could eat all he wanted. Alejandro listened with an attention he rarely gave even his most important clients. Each burst of laughter from the boy was like a gentle tap on the hard shell around his heart. Clara watched them from across the table, seeing a change in Alejandro's expression. For a moment, the apartment no longer felt too modest or too small. It felt exactly like the place where someone could start again. After dinner, Mateo insisted they should all sit on the sofa to read a Christmas story together. Clara grabbed a book and began reading, changing her voice for each character. The boy nestled between them, his head resting first on one shoulder, then on the other. Alejandro listened, but his eyes kept drifting toward Clara's face. He noticed how the soft lamplight drew gentle shadows on her cheeks. He noticed the tired but sincere smile that appeared every time Mateo laughed. He realized it had been years since he had felt this calm, this present in a single moment. When Mateo finally fell asleep, the silence that followed felt warm instead of awkward. Alejandro knew he should leave. An empty luxury apartment was waiting for him elsewhere in the city. He had a funeral to organize, documents to sign, practical steps to take after death. But he didn't want to get up from that sofa or walk away from that ordinary, miraculous room. He felt like a man who had wandered too long and suddenly found shelter. Clara, perhaps sensing the same thing, didn't rush to end the night either. They talked a little longer, now about lighter, almost playful topics. Movies that had made them laugh when they needed it most. Books they still remembered by heart. Before he left, they exchanged phone numbers under a simple, almost clumsy excuse. Alejandro said he wanted to return the favor someday, maybe invite them for a meal. Clara smiled, knowing that behind that polite offer there was something far more fragile. He walked back out into the cold night with a heart slightly less heavy than when he arrived. As he moved through the city, it still hurt, but it no longer felt completely hostile. The following days were a brutal mix of pain and responsibilities. He organized Carmen's funeral, received condolences from colleagues who barely knew her name. He emptied the house he had grown up in, each object carrying a memory that hit like a wave. Every room was a reminder of a life now closed, of a door he could no longer knock on. In the middle of that chaos, Clara's messages became like a thin but unbreakable thread. They weren't intrusive or demanding, just small notes that arrived at exactly the right time. A photo of a drawing Mateo had made of a man on a snowy bench. A short line saying she hoped his day had been a little lighter than the one before. A picture of Captain the Goldfish, with Mateo claiming the fish was asking about the sad man. Alejandro always answered, even on days when he barely managed to do anything else. Those exchanges quickly became the brightest part of his darkest days. It was as if someone were walking beside him down a long, empty hallway. A week after Christmas, Alejandro finally gathered the courage to ask for something more. He didn't ask to see Mateo, not yet. He asked if he could meet just Clara for coffee. He needed to talk to someone who understood grief without needing long explanations. She agreed, and they chose a small cafe in the center, far from his usual business haunts. Alejandro arrived early, something that almost never happened in his professional life. When Clara walked in with her cheeks flushed from the cold, something inside him loosened. They sat facing each other, and time seemed to slow down around their table. They talked for hours without checking their phones, like old friends catching up after years apart. They spoke about pain, yes, but also about what comes after pain. About how life stubbornly continues, even when you secretly wish it would pause and respect. About guilt and the strange way it often blends with gratitude for what existed. About Miguel and Carmen. About how two people who were gone still shaped their every choice. Then the conversation shifted into something lighter, almost playful. They laughed about silly movies that had helped them survive tough nights. They shared the titles of books that had stayed with them since their teenage years. They listed the tiny, everyday moments that, for no logical reason, made life worth enduring. When they left the cafe, the sky was already turning orange and pink. City lights flickered on one by one, writing their own constellation down on the streets. Alejandro walked her to her building door, deliberately slowing his steps. In front of the entrance, he hesitated, unsure how to say goodbye. He wanted to lean in and kiss her, but fear of rushing things held him back. It was Clara who moved first, cutting through the shared uncertainty. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him gently on the cheek, a small gesture filled with promise. She said she was glad she had met him, even under such terrible circumstances. From that day on, their closeness grew slowly and respectfully. Alejandro began to learn something completely new to him: how to go slower on purpose. He stopped stuffing every minute of his calendar with meetings and calls. He started reserving time for conversations that had nothing to do with profits. He visited Clara and Mateo regularly, sometimes bringing dessert, sometimes arriving with empty hands but a full heart. He took Mateo to the park, listened to his endless stories, pushed him on the swings. He discovered he could laugh without mentally checking his inbox between breaths. He discovered that shared silence with them didn't feel heavy. It felt healing. Mateo started calling him Papa Alejandro, a made-up title that cut straight through his defenses. He wasn't just Alejandro anymore, but he would never replace Miguel either. He was something different, a new, unique place in the boy's heart. Every time he heard those two words together, something opened a little more inside him. Clara, watching them together, felt a bittersweet combination of nostalgia and hope. She didn't forget Miguel, but she understood that love doesn't replace, it adds. Allowing herself to love again was an act of courage that had taken years to attempt. Now, with Alejandro, she felt that maybe life was offering her a second chance. 1 year after that first Christmas Eve, nothing in Alejandro's life looked the same. He had reduced his role in the company, delegating responsibilities he once clung to. He sold 2 of his 3 properties, keeping the Madrid apartment he now shared with Clara and Mateo. He stopped working 16 hours a day and discovered the world didn't collapse if he left at 6. He hung a framed photo of his mother, Carmen, next to one of Miguel in the living room. Mateo knew both stories and spoke of them as if they were old friends in the same sky. Every night, before bed, they said both names in a small, honest prayer. The house was full of honored absence and new, living presence. On the next Christmas Eve, Mateo had a very specific idea. He wanted to go back to El Retiro, to the exact same bench where everything had begun. He said it was important because places where miracles happen deserve a visit every year. Clara and Alejandro agreed, smiling at the boy's serious tone. They returned to the park, walking through the fresh snow that covered the paths in white. They sat together on the same cold bench, which felt much warmer now. Mateo in the middle, in his red coat again, just like the first time. The lights of the Crystal Palace glowed in front of them, as if they, too, remembered. Alejandro looked around and felt a soft kind of vertigo comparing past and present. 12 months earlier, he had sat there alone, convinced joy would never return. Now he was surrounded by warmth, by laughing voices, by hands that held onto his. He hadn't lost the sadness of missing his mother, but it was no longer empty. It was mixed with gratitude for everything she had been to him, and with the quiet certainty that she would want to see him exactly like this. Not behind a desk, but beside two people who loved him for who he was, not what he owned. The echo of his bad decisions was still there, but it no longer defined his whole story. Mateo watched him with those serious blue eyes and asked a direct question. He wanted to know if Alejandro was still sad about his mom, even though he looked happy. Alejandro took a moment before answering, because he didn't want to lie to him. He said yes, that sometimes he still felt a deep, sharp sadness, but that now the sadness was mixed with beautiful memories that made him smile too, and with the feeling that his mother would be at peace seeing him loved and not alone. He said the pain hadn't disappeared, it had simply changed shape. It was no longer a dark hole, but a shadow walking beside him, no longer in front. Mateo nodded with a seriousness far beyond his 6.5 years. Then he smiled and said something that made both Clara and Alejandro cry at once. He said he was glad he had lent his mom to the sad man on the bench that night, because now that man wasn't sad anymore, and he, Mateo, had one more dad. He said everyone was happy, and that this was the best Christmas present he could imagine. Clara wiped her tears away with her fingertips and squeezed Alejandro's hand over Mateo's head. Alejandro squeezed back, understanding the silent magnitude of that moment. Snow began to fall again, soft and light, like a blessing over all three of them. On that bench, 1 year later, there was no longer a lonely man, a widow, and a curious child. There was a family the world hadn't assigned them, but that they had chosen to build. They understood that sometimes family is not the one you are born into, but the one you create. Piece by piece, gesture by gesture, with patience, mistakes, and a lot of love. Sometimes it takes a 5-year-old in a red coat to remind us of that. A child who offers to lend his mother to a devastated stranger in a park. 7 simple words that ended up changing 3 lives forever. If this story touched something true inside you, leave a small heart in the comments and subscribe so we can keep walking through stories like this together.